All right, so hi everyone. This is our project identifying errors in SRL using weak supervision. Um, some introduction. Uh, so our mission for the project was to detect some noisy data point from benchmark SRL dataset using some weak supervision techniques with the promise of producing a cleaner dataset that will affect the performance of any model trained in those datasets. The noise detection is applied to SRL models, which is semantic rule labelings. In natural language processing, semantic rule labeling tasks allow us to understand who did what to whom in a sentence. It's usually done by assigning labels to word or phrases that identify their semantic rules within that sentence. Next slide.
So traditionally, semantic role labeling systems are composed of 4 components. Predicate identification, which is the process of giving a sentence, identify all the predicates within it. Disambiguation, which is the process of taking the sentence and predicates identified and mapping the predicates to its original word sense. The next part is identifying the arguments which are associated with the predicted predicates. After that, we will need to classify the predicted arguments to either if it's the first argument, second argument, or third, and so on for the predicates. It's important for SRL systems to be modularized as much as possible. And that's because errors on one stage can propagate to the next, which will mean that the end-to-end systems are inherently error prone. This happens when true positives and true negatives from one stage are converted to false positives and false negatives. Our design is going to be consistent of identifying the predicates and identifying the arguments. Next slide, please.
So going back to what we were mentioning previously, for our project, we're working with 2 large SRL datasets, OntoNotes and EWT. And these datasets are collected by scraping the web and from different genres, and we'll show that later. These datasets are also inherently error prone just due to the size of how large they are and how human labeling causes some error. We see in OntoNotes, there's about a 90% agreement in annotation. And for EWT and up, there's a 5 to 7% noise rate. When these errors are present in the test dataset, they can deteriorate the model's benchmark performance. And if they're in the train set, our model can generalize incorrectly on some of these labels and maybe produce worse performance. So either way, when there's errors in our dataset, we want to alleviate that and hopefully get better results.
So to make sure no pervasive instances are propagated down system, we're going to be using a confident learning algorithm to find instances where the labels are misannotated or the instance itself is erroneous. The framework fits into our end-to-end system after the predicate classification stage. So after classifying all the predicates within the sentence, we're going to use our framework to identify what our predicate model thinks is noise. And after we identify the proposed noisy instances, we're going to perform manual corrections on those instances and update our original corpus in hopes that the augmented corpus will lead to better results after retraining. Next slide, please. So the framework we're going to be using is called CleanLab. The main ideas of CleanLab is that it uses principles such as pruning noisy data, counting the estimate noise, and ranking examples to train with confidence. In order for CleanLab to utilize our model and identify what our model thinks is noisy, it first needs to generate a confident join matrix and a probability distribution for each instance. So in the image to the right, the top matrix is called the confident join matrix. Let's see. So the confident join matrix, how it's built, essentially it's a n by n matrix where n is the number of classes, and each cell it represents the counts for the amount of times a model predicted a certain class, whereas the actual goal label was another class. So ideally, if a model was perfect, then all the non-diagonal entries in the matrix should be 0. And how CleanLab is going to utilize our confident join matrix and the probability distribution generator to identify noisy instances in our data sets. Basically, all the non-diagonal entries where the instance is mapped to, that's considered noise. And we will prune it out from our data set. Next slide, please.
All right, so for the dataset, we selected, as Alex mentioned previously, we selected 2 of the main benchmark dataset used in SRL models, which is EWT and OntoNotes. EWT is a tree bank corpus that contains around 250,000 words, around 16,000 sentences, all annotated using universal dependency annotation. The dataset followed Connell format. It contained 5 categories, which is weblog, news, emails, reviews, and question answerings. It is publicly available by the Universal Dependency. It can be found in their GitHub repository. But unlike EWT, OntoNotes are not publicly available. It can be obtained from LDC website with license. It's relatively larger than EWT with 2.6 million words. It's also extended to more languages such as Arabic and Chinese. There is more metadata on it that represents some semantic and structural information such as syntax, predicate arguments, and many other more. Next slide, please. So in this section, we're just gonna see our end-to-end system, how we're gonna do the whole process. This is how our end-to-end system looks like. From the top left, we start by feeding our data set, do some pre-processing, then perform some predicate classification. Then the model get into CleanLab as one of the parameters. CleanLab will do the whole noise detection and produce the noise. And then for the noise list, it's extracted and sent to the annotators to do some manual validation to decide whether the noise flagged by CleanLab are actual noise or not. And finally, on the actual noise list, we just perform some correction and we feed it back into the original corpus and we do our own analysis. Next slide, please. So here are just some summary of the main experiment we conducted during the project. We built a baseline model for predicate classification. We did some grid search to find the optimal hyperparameters. We find that 150 word senses and regularization value of 0.01 is the optimal values. And then we did some enhancement for the model by building some BERT-based model. And we achieved much better F1 score. And then we did some study for manual evaluation in both data sets. And last but not least, we conducted some analysis to study the influence of our correction on the data set and on the models. Next slide, please. So this is an illustration of our baseline model integrated into our end-to-end system. We can see the predicate classification model that take the token embeddings and of our data set and then perform some multi-class classification where the predicate are the gold labels. And then CleanLab will take all the models as one of the parameters and produce our noise examples. With this baseline, we were able to do some accuracy or F1 score around 76%. And to the right-hand side, we can see some of the graphs of our experiment in the grid search. Next slide, please.
So as Sam mentioned, we had about a 76% F1 score over our logistic regression model. In order for our model to predict these noisy instances a bit better, we wanted to shift towards a neural-based classification model. So what we ended up using is to fine-tune a BERT model with a linear layer top head, and basically the logics that come from the linear layer are then softmaxed to produce the probability distributions of the class labels. So our input is this BERT tokenized sentence, and our output would be a label sequence of for each token in the example sentence, with the class labels being whether the token is a non-predicate, or whether, if it is a predicate, what is the word sense of it.
So here is some details on the blind validation study we conducted. The main purpose of this study was to define some evaluation metric, such as precision and recall. For both EWT and OntoNotes, we sampled around 200 examples, where half of those samples are actual noise detected by our end-to-end system, and the other half is considered as non-noise. And the sampling strategy followed our predicate model prediction, meaning that we choose to investigate a sample of the examples where token or originally have no word sense, but our predicate model predict that it should have one. And here are some results of both data sets. We have in EWT, we have around 65% precision and recall around 28%. In OntoNotes, we have some precision of 56% and recall of 20%. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so once we got these validation studies to get to a point where we felt comfortable starting manual actual correction, what we ended up doing is conducting a 5-fold cross-validation over our whole data set to then extract the probability distributions of each class label for the tokens. Using those, we fed them through CleanLab, and then we achieved, produced 2,900 errors within EWT that we had to look over, as well as 20,000 in OntoNotes that we'd have to look over. In terms of actually manually correcting, using a two-annotator inter-annotator agreement, we looked over at all 2,900 tokens. And for every token that needed to be evaluated, we'd have 2 independent annotators to decide whether this token was actually incorrect or not. And we evaluated this to be about 618 tokens to be truly incorrect. Once we collected these tokens that needed to be corrected, we created a script to modify our original data set and then do some analysis over the changes. And so here are some of the evaluation metrics that we see. To preface, what we did is we trained 20 different models, 10 independently over the original EWT training set, and then 10 independently trained over the corrected EWT training set. What we see here with a 95% confidence interval of plus or minus 0.0014 is that we do see an improvement between training and testing on the original data set versus training testing on the corrected data set. And these, while somewhat small of a change, we do see that it's outside of this 95% confidence interval when looking at the bounds of the original train. So we can see that there is some significant improvement. When we take a look at another evaluation fold, where we're only taking a look at the sentences that contain predicate corrections, and this is about 167 sentences in our test fold and 177 in our dev fold, we see a bit larger of a jump in performance when comparing the original train to the corrected train over this 95% confidence interval we have.
So the second part of our end-to-end system is identifying the arguments for the sentence. So just like our predicate classification system, we're going to be using a BERT-based model. We're going to be using BERT for sequence labeling. So that that's composed of a pre-trained BERT model, and we're going to be fine-tuning it on our EWT dataset. Followed by the BERT embeddings. We're going to be using a linear layer to get the logits for each token. And we're going to be applying a softmax and argmax to get the actual predicted arguments for each token. And we'll also be experimenting with dropout layer and using a cross entropy for our loss function. Below is an example of how our input looks to our argument model. So along with the actual given sentence from EWT, we're going to be using the predicted word sense from our predicate classification model as our context. Next slide, please. So these are some of the results that we found from our argument classification model. We trained it on the original EWT dataset, and we tested on the original dataset for EWT on the test and on the dev. And we also corrected the test sets for EWT. And we tested on the corrected test set, and these were the results below. Due to time constraints, we weren't able to correct the entire EWT, and we were only able to correct the test set. Next slide, please.
So in conclusion, for our whole project, we built an end-to-end system that detects noise in our SRL dataset, and the rate of which would depend on basically the type of data set is, how large it is. Evaluating these models when trained on both the original and corrected data set, we can see significant improvement over the predicate identification on our corrections versus our original data set. And so like basically this noise detection system that we have in for SRL data works. And we can see this as probably a first step to adapting this towards a data cleaning system for other sequence labeling problems like part of speech tagging or even named entity recognition. In terms of further steps, one thing that we want to do is we want to experiment more with, I guess, increasing our efficiency of our noise detection model. So basically getting more samples, as well as creating a pull request towards IBM System T repository that holds their EWT testing data set, as well as because we worked with CleanLab Confident Learning as a weak supervision method to noise detection, we also wanted to see if there's any way to maybe experiment with a supervised model for noise detection as well. So now we can shift towards the demo. What we wanted to show in the demo is how we annotated our data, since that took a majority of our effort for quite a few weeks, as well as show a short demo of our full SRL pipeline.
So just a quick overview through our annotation schema. We used this ProBank WordSense website. And for each token identified as noise, we did the following. We checked the original word sense in ProBank, and based on its context in the sentence, we checked if it matched correctly or not. If it does not match, but it is the right predicate, then we ask what should the correct word sense be. If the word is not a predicate, but our model say it is a noise, then we checked if the word should be a predicate in the sentence, and that's based on the word and its lemmatized form. Next slide.
Yeah, so here we have an example sentence with the word included being caught by our noise detection model. In the original data set, it was listed as a non-predicate, but when taking a look at the context as well as the PropBank entry for the word included 01, we can see that it is a word sense for this sentence. So what we do is, due to the context or based on the context, we see that included is a verb, and it's specifically being used in the include 01 sense. So the annotator would mark it as true noise. It would put in the correct word sense as well as the arguments. So you being the person that is including, me is the included person, and then people, which is the group in which arg1 is being included in.
Team 2, maybe just in the interest of time, could you wrap up your demo in maybe 1 more minute?
Yeah, we're almost done.
Okay.
We just have the live demo.
Okay. Thanks.
So maybe we can
here's
only just show one example.
Sure.
So in this sentence, neither did Cheney-Rumsfeld or Wolfowitz. When trained on our original data set, the model just didn't detect anything. It just thought there weren't any predicates. But when we actually take a look at when correcting over or trained over the corrected EWT, it was able to actually extract the proper word sense. And then with this example, the original original EWT model incorrectly labeled is as one word sense, but the corrected one labeled it correctly as B03. But yeah, that's our presentation.
All right.